Hello. And let's welcome back, as you just did, the Amphion Quartet. We've done so many of these together now, right? Mostly in previous years, obviously, but it's great. Today is Bartok's fourth string quartet. And I have to read something to you. I hope you don't predict it, but this only will be amusing if you were here for the last 2 weeks. So you know where it's going to go. This is Aaron Copland talking about Bartok. By now, I have met many hundreds of composers, but I should not think of one of them has been able to approach Bartok in sensitivity and musical sincerity. Isn't it amazing how often this comes up? Musical sincerity. It's so hard to know what anybody means by it, but there. Bartok does connect to Ravel and Fauré and Britten coming up, and everyone of that time, really, because they were all looking for new musical vocabulary, which is not what composers always do. I mean, it does happen quite frequently, but that wasn't true in the 18th century. People were creating new things, but they weren't looking for them. They weren't searching for a new identity, a way not to be, for example, German sounding, a way not to have to use tonality. What else can I use? I don't want to write in major or minor. I don't want to write like Schoenberg either. What do I do? That's Bartok's problem. He wanted to not sound German. He wanted to use the whole chromatic spectrum, all the notes in some interesting way, but he didn't want to imitate a German, or he didn't even like that world of Schoenberg's. And of course, what he discovered was the folk music of Hungary, which is his country, and also Bulgaria and Romania. And using the folk music, he developed his own language. But he wasn't just using folk music. That's really important. He was also trying to expand the way that music could utter anything. And so he was looking and listening to everything. And why don't we hear a little bit of music, and then I'm going to say something about the history of Bartok's looking for new music. Why don't we start right at the beginning and play up until right up into 14. This fourth song, right before 14. There's some new chords. Now those chords, there are really two principal chords that you've been hearing. They're both clusters, and a cluster means notes by chords by seconds. So if you think of a scale, normally we've been talking about how French composers took the thirds and kept going into ninths. But here, if you take seconds instead of thirds, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, like that, which is not what you heard exactly. Now, believe it or not, Bartok did not think of going or on his own. He actually wrote a letter and asked permission from someone. You know, it's a great story. It's a true story. Bartok was staying in a hotel in London where he was touring as a pianist. And it wasn't really even a hotel. It was a house, this is typical of England at that time, a house with several floors, and musicians would rent it and when they gave concerts. There are places like that all over Europe. I know many people who've met each other that way over the years. And Bartok was staying there, and he came downstairs, and there was one piano in the house. It was in the little living room area, so whoever got there first could play the piano at that time. And somebody was already there when he came down to use the piano. And that person was using his entire arm and going like this on the keys. And then he would take his fists and go like this on the keys. And he was playing interesting rhythms. Even though I know it won't do anything to this piano. Think about it. Why would this be worse than this for the piano? It's not worse. In fact, just as parenthetically, do you know what the Steinway factory does before they send out a piano? They take this machine that has a key, a hammer, not inside the piano, outside the piano. It's like fingers for every single key, and they smash it and smash it and smash it and smash it. And when it holds up to that, then they send it over to your house. Now, so there's nothing wrong with doing that. And when a little kid is visiting and starts smashing your piano, it's okay. Could be Bartok. Now, so the person he heard doing this was Henry Cowell, the American composer who had studied composition with Charles Seeger, who was one of the first musicologist in America, and he was Pete Seeger's dad, married to Ruth Crawford Seeger, who was not Pete Seeger's mother, his stepmother. Anyway, he was there. Cowell was from Menlo. Never heard of it, but it's somewhere out there in California. But anyway, he was staying in the hotel, and he was practicing clusters, smashing the piano like this, and Bartok was fascinated by this. And they talked for a while, and he invited, this was later, he wrote a letter, and he invited Cowell to Paris, where he played his clusters for Bartok and his friends, which the crowd that heard it included Ravel, interestingly, Ravel and Defiant. And they heard this pounding, and Bartok wrote a letter to him saying, "Is it okay with you if I use these things in my music?" And Cowell, thought, "I just was bashing a piano. It's not mine. You can." Even though he was an American, he didn't ask for any money, nothing. Now, there are two kinds of clusters there that get exposed, and they are commonly called, when we talk about Bartok, X and Y, because the X are half steps. That's as close as you can get. If your child or your grandchild or your nephew or somebody you know is going like that, that's really good, because you can't do that with your hand. You have to hit it's tricky. You have to use your fingers. This is whole tones. That's Y. In other words, X and Y. This is Z, which we'll get to in a moment. That's not only true for this piece, but for much of Bartok's music, there's a lingo attached to talking about it. X for half-step clusters, Y for whole tone clusters, and Z for this other configuration, which sounds like this too. Sorry, not that one. Things like that. So right at the beginning of this piece, what you heard was Bartok dividing the space in half, the X and the Y. The first thing you hear in the cello, and he's also developing a motif. Can we just hear the sixths at the opening? I feel like I'm exploding every so often, but believe me, I'm trying not to. If you can play the open sixths. Yes. Now these sixths, if you take that and turn it around, a sixth is a minor third. And if you turn each of those sixths around, you get a minor third. So what Bartok starts with is this open feeling, and he kind of compresses it down, and then it becomes a cluster. It almost sounds like the opposite of an explosion. And then it's tight. Can you play leading into 5, please? Dee-da-da-dee-da, from the E flat in the cello. Great. Perfect. Okay. So what you have there, if you get this, it'll set up the whole piece for you. You have the same motif. Derek is coming to fix my microphone. Is that true? Okay. In the cello, in the viola, second violin, first violin, it's kind of obvious. That's the same motif in a way. I can't say in different keys because there's no key, but it's transposed. It's the same thing at different levels. Da 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 dee dee dum dee dee dum. It's almost as if you were in different keys, but you're not. They're piling on top of each other. And those that get faster, they pile on in what's called a stretto which is an old word in music, it's an Italian word that means getting narrow. So if you have 10 people walking down the street, if the street gets narrow, they have to walk on top of each other. That's where the word stretto comes from. And that's exactly what he's doing. He does it with the intervals, he does it with the time, and then it's quite crushed together. So then they played a few clusters, and there were 2 clusters. The half-step cluster, oops, that's X. That's still X, and then you finally get a combination of X and Y. Now, let's see if we can hear these well. They're quite different. This one is crunchy. This I got from Carlo. He uses crunchy and smooth for everything. He was here last week. Crunchy and smoother. Now, these are whole tones, which could give rise to Debussy-like chords, which they do sometimes, and whole tone scales, which remind you of both Debussy and Ravel. But this is the tense part. So then what Bartok does with those 2 X and Y is the motifs, the themes, are all built on either half steps or whole steps. The relationships between the instruments, even when they're playing tunes, they're either a whole step apart when they start, or a half step apart, or they're split in counterpoint, a whole step and a half, and it keeps happening over and over. Now, if you take 2 whole step clusters and put them together, play them together, you get a half step cluster. That's not higher math, but it works. And so very often he divides, let's try a spot where he does that. Right at 25 with the chord before it, with the little pianissimo chord before 25. You want to keep going? Right before 25 into 25. Right, sorry. Yeah. Okay, great. Now, what you heard there relates completely to what we're talking about. You have the whole tones. Somebody's hearing aid is playing this, which is from Pierrot Lunaire. Okay, so then there's whole tone clusters, and then whole tone clusters here. So together, you're getting X out of 2 groups of Y. Now, this is a very simple thing. It's not what the whole piece is about, but it is there continually throughout the piece, the 2 sets of whole tones causing clusters. It's the way the energy is divided. Then you heard this in the first violin. This was just one violin playing this. So you have the tune here, this little motif, which is all half steps. But it's a rhythm, that you hear quite a lot. And then this second violin is playing it a whole step lower. And going in the opposite direction, the cello and the viola are playing an inversion, but they're all whole tones apart. If I put that together, first violin, second violin, viola, cello's down an octave. And let's hear just right there so we can concentrate on this little half-step motif being played in inversion, meaning opposite directions, starting whole tones apart. Let's do it right on da da da, if you can start right on that. Wow. Great. Now, it's not all about whole steps and half steps. There are 2 very important other aspects of the vocabulary. One is obviously rhythm, and the rhythms are drawn from a lot of Bulgarian, Romanian, and Hungarian folk music, but they're extended in his own world because the rhythms of the folk music are not that complex. So he takes the phrases and some of the rhythmic patterns and he makes them much more complex and personal. There's a lot of counterpoint. We've already heard some. And he himself, Bartok, summed up his language as being learned from Debussy, Beethoven, and Bach, with a grounding in Hungarian folk music. That's the inspiration. In fact, here's the quote from Bartok. Debussy's great service to music was to reawaken among all musicians an awareness of harmony and its possibilities. In that, he was just as important as Beethoven, who revealed to us the possibilities of progressive form, or as Bach, who showed us the transcendent significance of counterpoint. Now, what I am always asking myself is this: is it possible to make a synthesis of these three great masters, a living synthesis that will be valid for our time? That's what he's attempting to do. Now, what did he learn from Debussy harmonically? The idea that anything is possible. That was Debussy's idea. Any chord could happen. It could be built on whole tones. One chord could move in a strange place, and it doesn't have to be built on theory. It doesn't have to be built on a language that exists already, on preconceived ideas. It's all about the sound. That's what he got from Debussy. From Beethoven, he calls progressive form, and what he means is that the form, it's the progress of the form. It's organic. It unfolds, propelling itself forward bit by bit. Each motif sort of is organic in that, like a plant or like a human being or an animal. All the cells grow, and they make an organism. It's not an artificial process. It has to feel like it's actually growing. So that's what he meant by Beethoven's progressive form. And then for Bach, he's talking about counterpoint. He didn't just say counterpoint, because lots of people wrote counterpoint. He said the transcendent significance of counterpoint. For Bach, that's easy to understand. Bach's counterpoint, and all this is true of, I think, any great music, it means something. It's not just there. It's not just an exercise. The counterpoint, what does it mean? This is always dangerous territory, but I enjoy it. It means something in that the patterns and the ways things react to each other reflect either something biological, perhaps, or in the natural world, or philosophical. They reflect something. That's what meaning is. So counterpoint for Bach was about divinity, but therefore it was about the natural world and the universe. It was about diversity and unity. That everything is unified in a composition, and all the voices are doing something related to each other based on the same idea, like DNA, causing an organism to unfold. And the different strands of counterpoint are connected by this unified theory. So it does mean something. Now, Bach knew that. Bach knew that his subjects that he followed and the way the counterpoint unfolded was about something, and for him it was about the divine and about the world. And it was not just something he kept to himself. It's very well known. There's a lot written about it. People defended him, arguing about this. So when Bartok says the transcendent significance of counterpoint, he's talking about something meaningful. And for him, the way something was meaningful is if it connected to identity, which makes sense, and his identity was Hungarian, and therefore the folk music and the music around him, Bulgarian and Romanian rhythms, etc. This sense of identity, building technique from it, made meaning for him. So the other thing, though, are modes. Now this is important. I'm going to give you a little mode lesson before we get back to the piece. Major and minor are modes, but what Bartok wanted to do was use the modes of folk music, and then he decided to invent modes. And then he decided to figure out a way to compete with Schoenberg without doing what Schoenberg did, using modes. Now I'll explain that to you. Schoenberg took all the 12 notes that we have on the keyboard, which are the 12 notes of Western music. That was actually 13 because I repeated one. And Schoenberg would use them all. For example, here's a 12-tone row by Schoenberg. It's not a piece. It's just material. All right, that's something he used to build a piece on. And it has in it these two hexachords, two groups of 6. Each has a whole tone scale and a note that sticks out. First one goes whole tone scale and that note. and the second hexachord does that too. It almost sounds like music if you do that. Because the fact is these two hexachords have the same problem. They have an intruder. So it's interesting. So Bartok didn't want to write like that. But he liked the idea that Schoenberg opened up the chromatic spectrum. He used all the notes all the time. He wasn't limiting himself to major and minor or the Dorian mode, which was very popular. And of course, lots of French composers, Fauré and Ravel, used modes, as you heard last week. So a mode simply is an arrangement of notes that is, we're using it to mean something that's organized and recognizable that is not major or minor. So, for example, here's major. Here's a minor scale. There are other minor scales. But here's another mode. That's the Phrygian mode. Here's the Dorian mode. Now, in order to make this really clear, I took a tune everyone knows, and I rewrote just the tune in several modes, so you can hear what the mode does to a tune. Here's the tune. Now, if I put it in the Phrygian mode, instead of this scale that we had, it doesn't start on the tonic. It goes bottom, ba-da-da-da-da. So in Phrygian, it would sound like this. And if I put simple harmonies to it, it would be. It's a whole different world, right? So you can see it's interesting. Here is the Lydian mode, which is just like a major scale, but you raise the fourth note. There's the fourth note. I'm emphasizing it both visually and orally. Okay, there was a little much. So you might know it from West Side Story. Okay, Officer Krupke. And why is it there? Because hooligans, the only thing they've got is a raised fourth. Now, I mean, in other words, if you take a major key, it's kind of happy, but if you raise the fourth, it's annoying. It's a little bit mischievous. It's mischievous. It's a little humorous. So here is the same thing in the Lydian mode. Now, if I use chords for that, it sort of sounds a little bit like next week's composer. That's Lydian. See, it's only by removing one flat. So there are 12 notes, but they really matter. So here is the Octatonic mode. It's a mode we talked about because Ravel used it a lot in Gaspard de la Nuit. Here it is, just a tune. And the Octatonic mode is also called the symmetrical mode. That's a mode where it's alternating half steps and whole steps. It sounds like this. And if I put the simplest chords I can to it, it would be. So what you get from this, I hope, is that these different modes suggested to Bartok that he could use all these modes, and there are many, many, many more. He could use Romanian modes, Bulgarian modes, Hungarian modes, because folk musicians didn't go to a conservatory. So they didn't have anything written down. They didn't have rules. They didn't have lessons. They just learned from person to person. So very often, modes were highly different from place to place because nobody knew even what a mode was. You just knew the song, you knew the tune. If you listen to, and of course you can find it very easily on the internet, if you listen to recordings of folk music made by Bartok and Kodai, when Bartok and his composing friend and musicologist friend Kodai went on tour of Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria, just recording folk people singing. And they knew they better do it soon because there wouldn't be anybody left like that. And there probably isn't. In the world now, it's hard. There are some. It's very hard to find a person untouched by modern anything, and where they know folk songs that go back very far, that are uncorrupted, and that are left as they must have been. It's very hard to find people like that. If you know someone, let me know. And Bartok and Kodai went around recording it. They did not use iPhones. What they had to do, and they didn't even have tape recorders. It was before that. They used these wire recorders that weighed 50 pounds, and they were going into the mountains. There was no electricity. So they recorded these things by carrying their own generator. Sometimes by hand, because they couldn't drive, so they would drive up to a certain point. And then they would have these gigantic boxes that weighed a lot, and they would have to get quite a few people to move them somewhere, crank up the generator, and get someone to sing really quickly into this thing. And I mention all this not only because it's a great image, but very often the singing was terrible. They weren't professional singers. They weren't known for doing this. He would just find someone in a field and say, "Do you know any songs?" "Sure." "Hey, you can sing a song." "Hey." You know, they would sing something. And you listen to these recordings, they're incredibly out of tune. And then Bartok, though, I have to say, this is very interesting. His feeling was that they were not out of tune. He notated every little bit of out of tuneness and considered it to be authentic. Why not? What else are you going to do? We had a similar thing in America with Lomax, and actually Ruth Crawford Seeger was very influenced by this, Alan Lomax and those people who went around recording folk music, and a lot of those people also sang quarter tones and stuff, and the notation is very strange. So Bartok had these strange melodies. Sometimes they were stranger than they probably were meant to be, and he used those modes and the rhythms, and he used his technique of Debussy-inspired harmonic freedom, Beethoven-inspired progressive organic form, driving forward, and Bach-inspired meaningful counterpoint, and he created his own language. Now, let's get back to the piece. Before we play more of this movement, this whole piece, the fourth quartet, is a palindrome in that the first and the fourth movement share some material, quite a lot, and have a similar tempo and feel. And they even have, the fourth movement even has lots of quotes from the first movement, although it has new music. This second, did I say fourth? Fifth movement. Did I say fifth? Now I did. Okay, the first and the fifth movement, sorry, there are 5 movements. The first and the fifth are what I just described. The second and the fourth are related. The second is all, what is the second all? Muted. Maybe we'll get to that in a second. Get ready to do that. And the fourth is all pizzicato. So they're extreme, and they're related, and they share material. And the one in the middle is like the still point that T.S. Eliot talks about, the still point there, the dance is, except it's not that much of a dance, it's more of a still point. So let's hear a little bit of these other movements for a moment. The second movement is very X at the beginning. In other words, it's very half-steppy, and it's all muted. Let's hear a little bit of that. Great. And then another spot to listen to. Let's go to just before 75. This starts with a familiar cluster that Henry Cowell could have made a lot of money on, but didn't. Okay, now what you're hearing right there relates to everything I've been saying after the cluster, which has, it's all half steps. Then you hear this in the viola, and the cello above it. And that is another cluster when you put it together. And then you hear this. And that is a whole step collapsing in and another one collapsing in. And so you're getting whole steps, but you're also getting half steps. So again, all the music is concentrated very tightly at this point in a new texture with a new energy on whole steps and half steps. Oh, this is beginning to look like my room. Now, in the parallel spot in the fourth movement, so we can go right to 45. Okay, now this is that pulling of the string like that is called by musicians all over the world the Bartok snap, or the Bartok pits. And that's simply something that he took from folk players. You know, I mean, people teach themselves to play an instrument. Maybe he heard one person who went like that, and it became part of the music. We don't know how many people actually played like that, but there it is. Pulling the string hard away, it's kind of violent. But also you heard this, strumming. This is whole tones, and this is whole tones. Put them together, half steps. So this is, from the point of view of the technique we're talking about, it's y plus y equals x. And then this, and this, is just like what we heard before, right? When it was in muted, but now it's da-da-dum, bum, bum. Let's play this one more time. It's exactly like the other one. Okay, now the opening of the fifth movement is something we need to hear, and then we'll get back to the first, and I'm going to go in detail again. The opening of this movement has in it Z. We've had X and Y, and Z is this thing. You can think of it several ways. 2/4, as if they were in two keys. And it also is two tritones. In other words, we've got four notes, so we can hear them as two different sets. This one and this one. And he uses this set a lot. And the reason is if you double it to another place, and you, if you put them all together, if you get three of those, you have the octatonic scale. So he's building towards a way of getting at the octatonic scale from a very dissonant, crunchy, folksy thing. What makes it folksy is it's like two open fifth drones. Could you just play some open fifths on the cello, maybe? Because you have a spot where there are lots of open fifths. Maybe you can search for it. Yeah, with pizzicato. I mean, I didn't ask you to look at that, but if you can find that. Well, here, like for example, in the second movement at bar 34. And let's do viola and cello right at 34. This isn't so hard, but I am springing it on them. Yeah, now let's do it slowly. Yeah, what's happening there is the cello is playing open strings, all fifths, not playing the top one. And the viola is playing open strings a half step higher, except they're not open strings because they're a half step higher. But they're like open strings. They're on an instrument that doesn't exist. But it's giving us Z. That's the Z set, X, Y, and Z. So here's the opening of the last movement, which is full of the Z chord, which is very folksy and very, it's both dissonant, but it sounds like kind of a wild peasant dance. Okay, now what you're hearing there, that tune, is a typical Bartok. It's a corruption of a very simple mode. The most common mode in folk music all over the world is the pentatonic mode. The black keys on the piano happen to be pentatonic mode, which is why when you study piano, if you're a little kid, you might play pentatonic pieces just on black keys. You can't go wrong. It's a great way to learn to improvise because it makes you feel free and everything sounds good. There's music from every country, folk music, that uses the pentatonic mode because it's so easy to improvise in. And it's highly developed. Irish music and Chinese music are two examples of highly developed, and therefore American music when the Irish came here. So I sometimes call it the Sino-Appalachian mode. It hasn't caught on. It hasn't caught on. And then you get this dissonance in the cello. And what that is it's X. Played with two open strings. You want to give us one of those? Yeah, there it is. That's the, it's Z. It's the Z set, again, of this, of the 2/5, but compressed. So this, if I put the G to G sharp, it's pentatonic. But if you do this, it's a different world, especially if you do this under it. You know, okay. So that's some of the basic mode lessons. Now, let's go back to the first movement and get to know it a little better. One of the most fun parts of Bartok's technique, and one of the most exciting, has to do with not the rhythm of moment to moment, but the structural rhythm. Rhythm of moment to moment, it will be like da 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 dee da 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 da. That's fun, but you find that a lot of places. Again, just like pentatonic scale can be found all over the world, rhythms of asymmetrical rhythms of 3+2, for example, 1 2 3 4 5 1 2 3, or 1 2 3 4 5, they're all over the world also. In India, in Carnatic syllables, it's taka taka ta taka taka ta taka taka ta, or taka ta, or the other way around, taka ta taka taka ta taka. They have lots of things like that. 11s, which are found in a lot of contemporary music, are taka dimi taka ta taka dimi taka dimi taka ta taka. It's the same thing that Bartok uses, but it comes from India. So what he did, though, structurally, is something he took from Beethoven, which is rhythmic structure of the piece. And I'll give you a really good example, a couple of examples, because this is one of the most fun things that he does. Let's take a look at after 80, cello and viola, that thing that we tried. So you want to do the version that we talked about? See, all by itself, that's interesting, which is he takes the opening theme, it's getting shorter and shorter and quieter, and then suddenly it explodes. But actually, we left out a lot of music. Because what Bartok does rhythmically is several layers. He takes that idea that you just heard, but-da-dum, dee-da-da-da-da-dum, dee-da-da-da-da-dum, dee-dee-dum, dee-dee-da-dee-da-da-da-dum. He's keep playing with how long and short it is. But actually, this is what is going on. There's something that we left out. So we left out those violent attacks. There are a lot of them. So this back and forth, I think of it as very cinematic. A way to think about it that's visual this is a typical movie thing that I'm not sure if it was invented by Alfred Hitchcock, but it may have been, which is to have two things that are cut back and forth in a rhythm that creates tremendous excitement or suspense or fear. So you can even do this, and film students often do this exercise of taking two pictures, an innocent-looking face and a terrifying-looking face, and editing them back and forth in such a rhythm as that you feel like something terrible is going to happen, but actually they're still photographs. But that editing skill of timing the editing back and forth, A and B images, is really central to good film work, which is how do you edit things together. I mean, I know, I've done some film scores, not too many, but many, many years ago, I did one that had a short fight in it between two characters in a bar. And the director showed me this thing when he first filmed it. And it was terrible looking. These guys were moving very slowly, and they looked choreographed, and it didn't look real, and it was just, and it was very long and boring. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do with that? He said, no, I just wanted you to see it before I edit that. And he said, I'm just going to go back and forth between their two faces and certain parts of the picture, and it's going to get faster and faster. And the whole thing, the entire fight was actually done in the editing room. They never really did anything. And I was amazed by that. So I did the same thing musically, but I was thinking of Bartok, which is to try to copy that exact back and forth in speed, to take this guy's music and this person's music and go back and forth like the film. And it's incredibly exciting, like what you just heard. There are more examples in Bartok of this kind of back and forth editing. All right, let's try right before, at like 134, we had, let's do the version with the, starting with the G sharp. Okay, so listen carefully. This is going to be a double exposure, so to speak, a double lesson in Bartok's back and forth editing process. Okay, so that's some quiet, slightly suspenseful little thing. Now listen to this music. Okay, both of those passages that you just heard sound fine the way they are. One is suspenseful and quiet, and it gets longer and longer, 2 notes, 3 notes, 4 notes. And the other one is violent and angry, but actually neither of those exists alone. They're edited together by Bartok like this. This is how it sounds in the piece. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. That's how to listen to this, because the more aware you are of that, the more exciting it is. And it is exciting, though. It's like, that's what you're hearing. You're hearing things that may have been conceived of separately, edited together. In film, you know, it's often after the fact that the editor thinks of this. Like a film, I'm working on one now, so I'm thinking about it a little bit, but it really fits with this. A 1 hour film might have 15, 16, 20, 40 hours, who knows, of film footage. And it gets edited and edited and edited. But even a 2-minute scene might come from an hour's worth of material. We don't know, I don't see any sketches available of this, but it's possible that Bartok wrote these two sections separately. The one that's driving, and the dee-dum, dee-dum, pa-pum, and then he decided, this is better if I put it together. Now, Beethoven does do things like this. It doesn't sound quite the same because it's not quite so obvious, but there is one piece by Beethoven in a grand scale where he does exactly this, but the sections are long and they intersperse each other. It's two pieces of music, really, interlaced, and that is the Heilige Gedankengesang movement. It's a do you guys want to play that? It's a string quartet. I'll talk more about that another time, but let's put it this way. It's a movement in which Beethoven writes very peaceful, slow, introspective, spiritual-sounding music. It's interspliced with sections that are uplifting and what he calls its renewed energy, its health, restored health is basically what its subtitle is. And this spirituality and this coming back to life and health are intercut like this, only more slowly. You could actually get two movements out of that movement by Beethoven. It's extraordinary. It's one of the, I think it probably is the first example in music where it's really two pieces of music have been edited together to create one amazing piece of music. Has anyone ever played those separately? I don't think so. That would be really weird, wouldn't it? You don't look too eager to try it, but it would be very, very difficult. Now, almost everything else that you're going to hear in this first movement is in some way what I've talked about. It's X, the half steps, Y, the whole steps, Z, the cell. It is contrapuntal, very often inversions going in opposite directions, driving a wild counterpoint that is quite serious. Then it has the splicing back and forth many, many times of two different ideas. One is usually quiet and introverted, but it's growing, and the other one is violent. Now, maybe there's a metaphor here that's, I mean, maybe it's political. In his life, that would have been easy. You know, Hungary in his lifetime saw a lot, and he also lived through World War I and didn't see and lived through World War II, and he basically everything in his life was he had to leave, you know, Hungary. Everything was torment and war. And then, it was close to starvation when he died. So it's possible to hear the quiet music as something internal and personal, and the violent music as the state or the enemy or something outside. It could actually be very real. On the other hand, even if it's not that, we feel it in many personal ways. So the metaphor shouldn't have any one definition, because music suffers from that. It's better if it's open. So it could be personal, it could be political, it could be at the level of global war, it could be just between people, it could be a nightmare, but whatever it is, there is something violent and aggressive that seems to be continually tearing at something that tries to be peaceful. Which do you think wins? Well, it tends to be pretty violent, understandably. I think there might be a musical reference. Could you just play the last two measures, or just the pesante of this movement? Yeah. Now, of course, he's not writing in major or minor, so the mode here is Phrygian. But it also is changed, because this note is natural, and then it's flat. And the chords are dissonant, and they're also major minor. They could be jazzy. But there's this endings, you know. Does that remind you of anything? There's some Brahms and there's some Schubert that ends with da-da-da-da. And with Brahms, it's a reference to the Schubert, and that's this lowered second. So it's possible that Bartok was thinking of that, because he was always thinking of the history of music when he wrote, and he was very involved in it. He was a great musician on many levels, a fabulous pianist who also, as his students said, he knew the entire repertoire by heart except his own music, which he had to read because he couldn't remember which version he ended up with. Now, before we hear this movement straight through, I have a couple of more instructive Bartokian things to do for you. Just in terms of rhythm, 5/8, da da di da da, 1 2 3 4 5, or 1 2 3 4 5, 1 2 3 4 5. Either way, that pattern, if you take a melody and spin it in that pattern, it becomes something new. So I've taken a melody you know, and I put it in 5/8, and I've accompanied it with some Bartok chords. See if we can recognize it. Okay, so. So you hear it's there, it's just that the rhythm is off. One more time slowly. So the accents are falling in different places, which is what happens when you change meter. Sounds a lot easier when you know what's going on, right? Okay, now modally, here's another example. This is a very elaborate composition lesson in Bartok. I took a tune everybody knows, just about everybody, and I left it at first in its original mode, in the right hand. In the left hand, I used a different mode. Now, why would I do that? Because I'm now going to answer a question I stated earlier on and I never answered it. How did Bartok write chromatic music and not imitate Schoenberg? Modes are not going to give you the whole chromatic spectrum. He invented a concept called polymodal chromaticism. You have to remember that, it's really important. Polymodal chromaticism, it comes up in conversation, at least in my house I bring it up occasionally. Polymodal chromaticism simply means you take various modes from different cultures perhaps, or from one culture, but you string a few modes together, but you put them together so that you get all the chromatic notes. You can't do that with just any modes. It's not so simple. So the easiest way to get there is to take the Phrygian mode and you have to, in order to do this, put both modes on the same beginning note. Now if we take the Lydian mode, we get all the notes. They're all there. So by using two different modes starting on the same pitch, you get all 12 notes, but it's not the Schoenberg or the German approach, it's Hungarian. And that's what he does. So here I left the original mode for the tune, I accompanied it in a different mode to give more notes, and then I corrupted, which he also would do, I eventually corrupted the melody into another mode because Bartok didn't actually have a system. He didn't like systems. He didn't like the fact that Schoenberg kind of had a system. He liked consistency and method, but not system. So he used lots of modes. He knew that any mode was available. Any mode could be corrupted. The modes could exist simultaneously. The rhythms could work against the patterns. That there would be counterpoints, that he used certain chords that he liked, but there was no actual system. This was a vocabulary that he used. So here is a tune you all know, which I'm going to apply all of those things to it. Now it gets corrupted. So it takes it to another level. And this kind of folk melody, Mary Had a Little Lamb, I hope you got that. You never know, because you can get carried away, with the rest of it and forget what it is. But Mary Had a Little Lamb isn't that different than some of the kinds of folk tunes Bartok used. He used little nursery rhymes, things that kids sang in at school, and then he used his technique like that to create these things. Sometimes he would set them very purely, but eventually he didn't. He stopped doing that and he went for composition. I'll do one more and then we'll hear the whole piece. Now this one is more elaborate. This one I use techniques from this quartet specifically, and the language of this quartet that you're about to hear, combined with not a children's tune, but a tune, a popular melody from the, I guess it was 1960 something. But everything I'm doing comes out of this quartet. So did you follow that? Okay, that's the Beatles. It's been a hard day's night. Okay, well, now if you didn't follow it, it's important to hear it, otherwise it's no fun. So here's the tune. So what's accompanying that is Z and X and Y. And counterpoint. Imitation all over the place. And counterpoint here, for example. So now I'll play it again, and I think it'll be easier to follow. It's been a hard day's night, which, believe me, it was to put this together. So, is that good? I have to say, it's just a little secret is that even though I have to write these things for my piano poster show, I actually often write them in order to prepare for a lecture. That's how it started, because if I want to understand a composer, by doing something like this, I get it all straightened out. So I actually wrote that one in order to make sure that I covered everything in this quartet, which I think we have. Are we ready to hear the first movement? Are you guys ready to play the first movement? All right. Bartok Quartet number 4, movement 1. next week? You are? Okay. So next week they will be back to play the Britain. So I hope to see you all and all your friends. Thank you. Next time.